With the Festag DLC coming somewhat around the corner, I want to talk about my speculation for what that DLC might possibly be. We do know that there is a DLC, either announcement or full launch coming in the December portion. That's when Festag is. So we have a couple things to look forward to, hopefully. They were saying that this is going to be a little bit different than their previous DLCs. So in this video today, I want to discuss my two picks for the races, the lords, the units, starting locations, as well as what their, I guess, overall objective would be in a Vortex and or Mortal Empires campaign. So join me today and let's have some fun going through some possible speculations of what this could be. And again, huge disclaimer here, this is baseless. It's really just me taking a look at stuff that's not included into the game and working off of some base assumptions and so on and so forth. So really take all this with a grain of salt. It's more of a, hey, this would be kind of cool, and if we got any of it, it'd be awesome. If we got all of it, you can, conspiracy theory, or tinfoil hats, whatever. Let's dive on into what we have here today. Before we really get into the real thick of this video, and this is going to be a very dense video, I do have to say up front that anything that I bring up in this video, I will not be explicitly talking about the individualistic lore of all the generals, all of the lords, all of the heroes, units, what have you that I bring up. I'll maybe say like a sentence or two, and I'll maybe discuss about how I would see them translated into Total War Warhammer, but it's mainly going to be focused on the speculation of those units rather than the individual lore. I have done lore on some of the things we're about to talk about, so if you want to see that, go ahead and look for their respective videos. But here's some assumptions that we have to work under, right? We know that the Festag DLC will not include an old world update, meaning that we'll see either Warhammer 2 races or Warhammer 1 races that have already had their old world update. So that Warhammer 1 list includes Dwarfs, Empire, Bretonnia, and Vampire counts. Now, we can remove Vampire counts from this list because Creative Assembly has told us that Vampire counts are not coming anytime soon. So we're really working off from a Warhammer 1 perspective, Dwarfs, Empire, and Bretonnia. I'm going to nix Empire from this list because we just had them. That might be kind of a false statement here because, you know, we're getting Lizardmen so close together, right? We just had 10-1, and now we just had Nakai, so they might do Empire, but I'm going to remove them from this list because of the unlikely position that we get Empire. So we're working with Dwarfs and Bretonnia. So really, those are the two that we're working from a Warhammer 1 stance. And my ultimate claim is that we're going to be seeing Dwarfs from Warhammer 1 and Skaven from Warhammer 2. They just make the most sense as far as two competing races from Warhammer 1 and Warhammer 2 to put together. It doesn't necessarily need to be Warhammer 1 and a Warhammer 2 race, but I think that this would be a very fun and very thematic DLC, especially for what I have in mind. So some working titles, I guess you could say, would be Master in the Moulder, or Master in the Unclean, or Master in Monster. If you can't guess, I'm really hung up on the Dwarf portion being Master, and the Skaven portion being something related to Clan Moulder. So my big assumption, or I guess my big projection, is that we're going to see a Dwarf and Skaven DLC, and it's going to be Thorek Ironbrow and Throt the Unclean. And we will talk about some other legendary lords that it possibly could be, but those are going to be the two that I'm mainly framing this video around. So Master in Moulder, Master in Unclean, and Master in Monster, who knows? Thorek is the Master Runesmith of Karak Azul, and we have Throt the Unclean, the Master Moulder of Clan Moulder. So these are why I'm kind of punching around those names. Now, Rich also did mention in his AMA that this DLC will include a fan favorite. So when I look at these guys, when I think of Thorek Ironbrow, I really, personally, I don't look at him as a fan favorite when it comes to Dwarf Lords. Even the mighty Throt the Unclean, I don't think of him as a fan favorite. But that fan favorite part we'll save until we jump into the Dwarf, or the Skaven section of this video, because I think it plays very well to what I have in mind off of that rich statement from the AMA. But let's jump into the Dwarfs, the legendary lords, heroes, units, and what have you. And here we have my grand, I guess, speculation list for what I think the Dwarfs would include. You can see here that we have the legendary lord being Thorek Ironbrow. So this kind of derives the name for this specific faction in Thorek's Throng. There were a number of names I could have gone with, Thorek's Expedition, but I felt like that was a little too, ham-fisted when we just have the Hunts Marshal's Expedition. I thought of Karak Azul, but if this is a Mortal Empires and a Vortex campaign, Karak Azul is not on the Vortex campaign. I thought about just giving him the name of Karak Zorn, where I think he would be on a Vortex campaign, but again, I think that kind of really gets curtailed when you look at the Mortal Empires maps. So there are a lot of different, I guess you could say, names you could go for this faction. Clan Ironbrow could be one that they could go with, because that's the actual name for on the roster of him for the, not roster, but the clan record of Karak Azul. But there's a number of names we could go here. I'm going to go with Thorek's Throng as my my placeholder. Now, the other legendary lord I was thinking of was Joseph Bugman. He is a bit of a fan favorite, right? Bugman's Brew, it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek joke that you make throughout the entirety of Warhammer, but that was my other option for the legendary lord for the dwarfs, but I just felt like Thorek Ironbrow from, I guess, a unique faction standpoint just brought a lot more to the table. Now, as far as our generic legendary lord, I went with the Demon Slayer because we already have a Rune Lord. Demon Slayer is the Lord version of a Slayer, a special kind of Slayer. And the hero version of that Slayer would be a Dragon Slayer. If we had gone with Joseph Bugman, we would see a Brewmaster on this list instead, perhaps. Now, units, we've got Doomseekers, Goblin Hewers, Runic-Collared Shard Dragons, we've got Runic Guardians, Thunder Barges, and Rune Golems. I'm going to go into each one of these, don't worry about it. This is a quick little synopsis before we dive in on each and every single one of these. And I think that, of course, this is way too many units for a DLC. We typically don't see 6 whole brand new units, but I felt like, hey, if I'm going to talk about the speculation, why not go off the rails entirely and just show you guys a bunch of cool units that are just deep enough in the lore to be relatively obscure, but also really cool and add a lot of flavor to the overall dwarf roster. Because that's the thing with the dwarf roster, is it's very complete. Almost everything is in Total War Warhammer from the dwarf book. There's maybe a scant few things that I can barely remember off the top of my head, but for the most part, it's one of the complete rosters. Just like the Tomb Kings, the only thing they're missing is like a Tomb Swarm, and even then, you can still summon it up. So the dwarfs are one of those things I kind of had to dive deep on to find stuff from the Warhammer RPG, from the Storm of Chaos supplement. That's where you get the Doomseekers and the Goblin Hewer. From stuff like the Monstrous Arcanum, that's where you get things like the Rune-Collared Shard Dragons. The Thunder Barges is something that hasn't been in Dwarf lore for a long time, but they play a big portion of Gotrek and Felix, so it'd be a pretty interesting thing to see them. So let's dive into each and every one of these and how I think that they could really be incorporated into Total War Warhammer. Before we really dive into that, though, I think it's worth bringing up how I'm going to format these two sections going forward, the Dwarf section and the Skaven section. First, I'm going to talk about the Lords, the Heroes, and the units, respectively, as we've just seen right here. And then after that, I'm going to go into the possible starting locations on both a Mortal Empires and a Vortex campaign scenario. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about a specific faction mechanic for each one. And then as far as the Vortex objective, I'll save for the very end after I've gone through both lists, and we'll combine them together because I feel like talking about that Vortex objective you can't do without having discussed the other race. So we'll save that for very last, but just to recap here, Lords, units, faction mechanic, and then lastly starting location. Let's dive on in here into these individual aspects. You can't have Thorek's Throng, though, without Thorek Ironbrow himself. And I think that he is a very important legendary lord to have, because he is a Rune Lord legendary lord. He would have an Anvil of Doom mount option that you could turn on and off through his skill tab as it gets there. And that's a big portion of him as a character in Total War or Tabletop, is that he was never seen without his Anvil of Doom and his little trusted guardian, or I guess apprentice. In addition to that, though, he would have a number of different campaign effects. Runesmith bonuses, entire army could possibly cause fear as a result of the Rune of Doom, one of his quest items. In addition, I would say maybe a construction cost reduction, runic forge requirement reductions, and also we'll talk about runic smithing, which we'll talk about in a little bit, or rune crafting, I guess you could say. And we'll talk about how that might possibly factor into his campaign effects. But 2 other quest items that he would have, and one I already mentioned, would be the Rune of Doom, his kind of very famous rune that is kind of attached to him. And it has the ability to essentially, and the way I would translate this in Total War Warhammer, would be to summon a unit of ethereal dwarf warriors. That, I guess you could say in a similar vein to Arkan's Tombblade. And I think it'd be a really crazy and different way to get an item on A, a race that doesn't have summons, and B, a character you wouldn't expect to have it. That's why I think it would be very fun to have the ability to summon up, like, you know, an 85-second unit of ethereal dwarf warriors, which would be so strong in their own right. Now, also we have Claude Brakak, his personal hammer here, and that would do things like Sunder Armor, AP, again, a quest item. Maybe this would also, I'm saying Sunder Armor because it just makes sense to me, Rune Lord standpoint. I think this would also give him a little bit more staying power when it comes to being in combat. I mean, the Rune Lord himself doesn't have absolute god-awful stats. He has some pretty decent little AP melee damage he can do. Why not make the Master Runesmith of Karak Azul a relatively formidable opponent when it comes to melee? So this is how I would see Thorek Ironbrow translated into Total War Warhammer. Now I'm going to lump these next 2 here together, both the Demon Slayer and the Dragon Slayer, because I feel like they can't really be too different. And essentially the Demon Slayer would just be a generic Lord version of Ungrim Iron Fist. That's essentially what I'm going here for here. And he would have a special skill line, exclusively maybe giving benefits to Slayers, just maybe 1 or 2 little things in a yellow tree for him, or maybe some sort of specific benefits for Slayers in general, or him himself. Like maybe he gets the ability to have, rather than actually having Red Ruin from Ungrim Iron Fist, he gets his own little generic version of that, just like we get when we look at, say, the Red Crested Skink, how they get the Warrior's Crest, and 10-1 does not. So I could see the Demon Slayer having their own specific one-off ability or special rule, whatever it is that only applies to them. And then a further extension of that, the Dragon Slayer will just be a watered-down version of a Demon Slayer, in I guess the regard that maybe you don't get that special ability. He's just basically a Thane with a higher weapon strength and death blow. Maybe on on campaign map, he can reduce the Slayer upkeep of any army he's embedded in. Maybe that can be his special hero benefit. But I don't think that the Demon and the Dragon Slayer need to have a ton of rules or special, I guess, things about them. They kind of speak for themselves as Slayers, as just kind of very senior and very strong Slayers. So making them Slayers with stronger stat lines as a single entity, slightly watered down Ungrim Iron Fist, it's a pretty open and shut case, very easy translation, and I think that makes for a very strong hero or generic legendary lord, because we already have Rune Lords and we already have Runesmith. So I think it's a pretty easy there. Now our first unit on this list is the Doomseeker. So we're going to go basically through the first 3 units, which are, I guess, more or less human or dwarf, I guess, for that matter, and the last 3 which are different in a way different way. So Doomseekers were from the Storm of Chaos supplement, and they're really awesome. They're Slayers with these chain, like a handle with a chain and an axe at the end of that. It's insane. So the way I kind of see these guys translated is they've got Frenzy, they've got Anti-Infantry, they've got AP, but think of them more as a controllable Goblin Fanatic. Rather than pressing a button and unleashing these guys, they actually stay and just rip through a unit. So maybe they're not a full-strength unit of Slayers like we typically see with a non-monstrous infantry unit. They'd maybe be more along the lines of a weapon team's level of size, like 12, 16, I don't know, 20, like something small. Not maybe specifically a weapons team unit size, but something that isn't the massive block of an infantry unit, but is still supplementary to that. And if they're, I guess, their own way, a dwarf weapon team like we see with the Trollhammer Torpedoes or the Fire Drakes. But I think that the Doomseekers would be a lot of fun, especially in a Skaven-themed DLC, to bring a unit that just can tear through stuff in close combat in the same way that I kind of envision the Doomseekers doing. Piggybacking off of that, let's talk about the Goblin Hewer. Also added in the Storm of Chaos, this thing, as you can see, is pretty insane looking. So the way I envision it would be near constant firing, but also short range. These things are basically throwing axes. So I expect a lot of AP, maybe even shield breaker on them, with a range of maybe even only like 100 or maybe 150, something that's more in line with a foot range unit and less in line with an artillery piece. But here's the kind of cool thing I think that would make them very thematic. What if they were crewed by slayers? So if these things were actually attacked, they could fend for themselves. Now, I know what you're thinking. It is kind of weird to have 2 Slayer-centric units and 2 Slayer-centric lords and heroes in a Rune Lord themed DLC, but we already have Ungrim Iron Fist, and the only other Slayer of note that I would say worth adding would be Malachi from the Gotrek and Felix books. So actually plays nicely into our next option here, but that's really the only way I'd say getting these added to the game in a DLC themed around dwarfs. So that's why I've added them into this list. You can let me know what you think in the comments below. But let's jump over to our next one. Malachi, like we just mentioned, flew this, a thunder barge. Now this is basically a zeppelin. We've seen this in a lot of art from Warhammer tabletop. There's a specific one that's actually a named one, the Wrath of Thunder. So this I think would be a very fun and different and interesting way to spruce up the already kind of waning air force of the dwarfs. If you really think about it, as far as future DLCs go, when it comes to the High Elves, the thing we're going to need to add it for them is Loather and Skycutters. So Thunder Barges can really act as, I guess, that blueprint, that guinea pig for an eventual Loather and Skycutter. And if we get access to Thunder Barges, that'll, like I said, help increase air superiority in a dwarf army. What I'm going to talk about after this unit will kind of shore up some of the gaps I think of in the dwarf army from a Total War Warhammer perspective, not from a tabletop perspective. And I think the Thunder Barge is the beginning of that iceberg here. So I think the Thunder Barge itself could have multiple variants, an organ gun or a cannon variant. So I think AP anti-infantry or AP anti-large, maybe an innate magic resistance. But what about a third variant, which I think could be very similar to how we are getting with the war wagons now? A third bomber-centric unit with Thunderers on it. So it's got Thunderers that are shooting AP missile fire, of course, but it's more of a bomber-centric unit. Now, the Thunder Barge itself did have the ability to drop a bomb. So we could say that Thunder Bombs, which is what they did drop, is innate in all of them, but it is more prevalent in the bomber class, just like we already get with the Gyrocopters and Gyrobombers. So that's, I guess, my thought or expansion on that for the Thunder Barges. Starting in on our first of 3 kind of more unique or different units for the dwarfs, I want to talk about the Runic Guardians. Now, you could look at these as kind of, I guess, something akin to Ushabti, but I want to kind of bring your mind in parallel with the Sacred Kroxigors. Because while these are constructs, I want you to think of that sock and bopper imagery of a Sacred Kroxigor. This would be a monstrous-style infantry unit. With AP, anti-infantry, unbreakable. They would have a high amount of armor, but I would say a very low amount of melee defense. You know, I picture these things to be quite slow. They would cause fear. At the same time, though, the lore does talk about them having this what you would equate to as perfect vigor. So I can kind of see these guys having perfect vigor on either the standard variation or the Regiment of Renown. And the way that the lore even talks about these guys is there's these huge dwarf constructs with rather than hands, they're whirling axes. So that's where I kind of want that imagery of Sacred Kroxigors. And again, this is something very different from what we've talked about in the past with dwarfs. I mean, Doomseekers, Goblin Hewers, Thunder Barges, these are all dwarf-run engines of death or just dwarfs themselves. And for the most part, when you look at the dwarf line, you see a lot of just plain dwarfs. Even the Gyrobomber and Copter are still steam engines controlled by dwarfs. This is a completely autonomous, not individual, but construct that is controlled by a rune of waking. So it's actually controlled by a rune lord and not on its own accord. So that's why I think it'd be a very different way to approach what I think is a very big issue for the dwarfs. And this is why I've brought these 3 units to the table in the Rune Golem, in the Runic Guardian, in the Rune Colored Shard Dragon. Is that mainly, when you take a look at the dwarfs on tabletop versus Total War Warhammer, they have a big issue that they never ever faced on tabletop. It's units like feral mammoths, dragons, anything just plowing right through the unit and knocking things all over the place. So with that said, you really have to take a look at how you can even the odds for the dwarfs in Total War Warhammer. Even if you look at stuff like fast-moving cavalry, you really were only limited by your board itself when you played tabletop. But as you take a look at stuff in Total War Warhammer, you have such a huge map to traverse that these things become so much better tools than they ever were in tabletop. So when I take a look at the dwarf line, I think they need something to stop the momentum of these big creatures. I think just adding mass to infantry will eventually get to the point that it's a caricature and you have a mammoth punting a dwarf 2 inches, and it just is like, okay, well, we've tried to balance the game in pursuit of a competitive scale, and instead we just made it ridiculous. So I think that adding one, if not all 3 of these to the dwarf roster would help give them some ability to fight on the battlefield, along with stuff like Dreadsaurians or Necrolith Colossus, all these monstrous creatures that have entered the game. I mean, especially with the Dreadsaurian coming in, it's only a tale of larger creatures to come. And just like with the Thunder Barge giving dwarfs an ability to fight in the air a little bit more potently, I think that Runic Guardians, Rune Golems, and Runic Collared Shard Dragons are a great way to add some stopping power to the dwarfs. And I guess going further from there, the Rune Golem, which would just simply be like a single entity Runic Guardian, but larger. So high magic resist, high armor, again low melee defense. I would expect a massive weapon strength on these guys, but a very slow swing. So maybe these things can chunk out damage if they can at least stay in combat long enough to really give their slow, deliberate, like 10-second swings, whatever it would be. And I would say AP and anti-large on these guys, causing terror, whereas the Runic Guardians cause fear, of course. And maybe give the Rune Golem perfect vigor. I see the big crux of both of these having a very slow speed of like maybe 50, maybe 45, something just very slow. The only fact that they can move quickly is because they can take large strides. That's what I think the overall theme has to be. Let's jump into our last unit for the dwarfs. And that is, of course, the Runic Collared Shard Dragon. Now, the Shard Dragons are pretty cool. They kind of like mold their way through the under portions of the old world. And they hang up in the caves and everything. They can climb up walls and stuff like that. And dwarfs essentially created these runic collars to bind them and control them. So I think that this is an amazing way to add a dragon-style unit to the dwarf army that is extremely lore-friendly. These things were in the Monstrous Arcanum, which was a part of 8th edition, so this isn't like a very far-flung, obscure reference. Even so, I mean, when you take a look at stuff like Mourngulls, those things were mainly from Forge World, so you're looking at stuff that still has a very relevant part to play in the entirety of the Warhammer Continuum here. So again, for these guys, large AP dragon unit, they have a special ability called Rabid Frenzy. So I would see this as a frenzy that gets stronger the lower their health is. The way it was interpreted, at least that's how I interpret it, because their lore is more based off of the fact that if they take damage, they immediately deal damage. So this way I could see it like, okay, give them frenzy, make it a bit of a different one that's exclusive to them. Now they do have an ability called Razor Scales, which essentially is like a damage shield. So if you attack them, you get hit. Now I think that the Razor Scales in this could just simply be a physical resist for the monster, with very little ways to have this, because this isn't fly. This thing's going to be walking around on foot. With very little ways for it to get into combat quickly, I think that it having an innate physical resist is a good way to kind of keep it relevant on the tabletop, rather than have it just get completely sniped out because it's only charging at like a 60 or 70 speed. But I mean, with the Feral Carnosaur, that thing, or I'm sorry, Feral Dreadsaurian, that thing's got some serious wheels on it, so maybe we see something very similar to that with the Runic Collared Shard Dragon. So moving on though from our units, I want to talk about rune crafting. Runes in general are a huge part of the tabletop version of the dwarfs, and I still feel like it's a very massive missing black hole in the dwarf roster. I think like the fact that the dwarfs don't have many missing units, but they're still missing runes, is more painful than them actually missing units. Runes play a huge part in how you divvy out points to individual lords, individual heroes, very strong special and rare choices. So I think rune crafting can bring a lot to the table. And I think that I've broken this down into a couple rules here. This has been assisted, and actually it's entirely the idea of Matt Ross here, Overkill247. He has an amazing idea for rune crafting, and I'm presenting it to you guys here. And he has a number of rules here. And these rules are not his own. These are directly from the 8th edition on how you can imbue runes into your items. This way it kind of balanced it out, so you couldn't just have, hey, I'm going to take 15 of the strongest weapons and I'm going to give them all to my characters and they're all going to have the same runes. This was a way to balance that out on tabletop, and I see the same thing happening for Total War if it were to be added. So for one, the rule of 3. A max of 3 runes on any one item. Now this says item. I'm going to say that this can be applied to both items and units. Because in my mind, I think the rune crafting system should play right into the current runic crafting that Runic Forge we already have, but it should give you the ability to make a special Regiment of Renown unit, sort of like your own custom Regiment of Renown unit that has specific traits that you would like to imbue into it. Now, when we're looking at the max of 3 runes, that would be 2 basic runes and 1 master rune. Choose. Now, the rule of form is a category-specific rune, so you can't say give a weapon rune to a item, or like a cloak, or a weapon rune to a unit. You'd have runes that are specific to whatever their specific use case is. Rule of pride. No 2 items can be the same. And again, no 2 units can be the same. This would prevent you from just spamming the strongest runes on the strongest units over and over and over and over. So you kind of have to vary things, make it interesting, and keep it engaging. And lastly, you also have jealous runes. Now this just means that 1 master rune per item and or unit. Again, just a great way to balance things out, so you're not just dealing with a massive amount of runes being just pumped into all these units that you can just kind of get out of control with. Now, what you really see with this system is a great way to customize your playthrough with the dwarves, right? And I'm always about that. How do I make my playthrough unique to me? So how do you acquire these runes? And I think that there has to be a number of ways to do this, or a specific system for it. And runes, for the most part, are not all-encompassing or all-known by every single rune lord. They discover these runes and the recipes through all their many travels, and that can maybe be the overarching theme for Thorek here, is that he has, his own custom set of runes that he knows, but he's also in search of more riches and more runes and more of faction specifically I haven't gotten to, which I will get to at the end of this video. But acquiring these runes, I think you start off with maybe a handful of very generic ones, like, oh, this one increases weapon strength, so on and so forth. And then you can find runes. So certain runes can maybe be found in the world, taking certain settlements, defeating rogue armies. And I think that this is a theme I want to go with for this DLC, is make rogue armies pertinent again, make them something that's worthwhile. So defeating certain ones might get you specific rare runes that you can't get anywhere else. That's what I think would be a little bit fun or diverse and interesting. You can research runes, or at least get runes as the result of a research, might be the better way to word that. That way you're not having a tech tree that's rune driven, you're having a tech tree that's tech driven that rewards you with specific runes, which I guess is kind of the same thing, but still. And then maybe campaign runes that are established by maybe doing specific things like objectives, like get 3 settlements, get 5 settlements, get 7, get 8, that one quest that typically reoccurs, or complete portions of the main objective of the Vortex or Mortal Empires campaign. That's how I think you can really, add runes to this and make them a viable way to just kind of add an additional item to this already present system in the Runic Forge. You would be using Oath Gold. You would also just be using runes that you get by doing, you could even look at them almost like followers. You would get them in your repertoire that you can then use in the Runic Forge. However that would really work. I'm not sure on the actual logistics of it. It's just an idea, and I think that adding runes to the game is a very important and very strong portion of the Dwarf Society, like I said, and I think it's a shame that's not in it already. So that's why I've put such a huge amount of effort in trying to present this here to you guys. But our last portion on the Dwarfs is the starting location. Where would these guys start Vortex campaign, and where would they be on a Mortal Empires campaign? Well, for the Vortex campaign, I'm going to go with Karak Zorn. There's no reason that they couldn't be put there. I mean, for what we've seen with Creative Assembly, they'll just put anyone anywhere because that's what they can do. It's their game. As long as they've gotten the thumbs up from Games Workshop, they can really do that. And I think that having a playable dwarf presence in the South Ends would be more fun. I wouldn't want to see them in the Spine of Sotek. That's just, it's too crowded as it is. And I wouldn't want to see them in the northern portion of the Southlands, smack dab next to Sudenburg and all the Tomb Kings. It would just be, it's too crowded right there as is. So I think putting them in the south opens, I think, that portion of the map to a little bit more playability. Typically to get there, you'd have to play Cetra and move south. You'd have to play Moors and move northeast, or you'd have to play Crockgar and move around to get there. So I think this is a cool, interesting place to start. I mean, you've got Tic-Tac-Toe, which is just to your south. You've got a bunch of stuff to your north, vampires. You can try to ally with the Wood Elves. That might be your first natural target. So I think for a Vortex campaign, Karak Zorn makes the most sense, and that's why I haven't chosen the name Karak Azul for these guys. Now, for the Mortal Empires map, again, Karak Azul makes the most sense, but also why I did not choose Karak Zorn as a name for this faction. And I mean, if you take a look at it, it's already on the map as a faction. It's a little close to where Thorgrim is, but it's not too close, and it has enough diversity that it's far enough south that it could nicely bridge that gap between the Southlands and the Badlands for any kind of play from a dwarf player. And you could just keep Karak Zorn as an AI faction on Mortal Empires. I actually can't even remember if they're on Mortal Empires, but Karak Azul, adding them as a playable faction for Thorek, I think makes the most sense. That sums up our, I guess, foray here into the dwarfs. We have a lot of very diverse units that I've offered to you guys here, right? All these runic constructs that is very indicative of Tomb Kings, but I think at the same time is very flavorful for the overall dwarf lore of making these grandiose things. One thing I'm going to mention as one of the objectives I had originally thought of that would be very cool for Thorek is that his objective would be to get the a bunch of parts for the Granti Duraz, which is a massive rune golem. It was basically destroyed during the War of Vengeance or times right before then. So its parts are all kind of scattered to the seven winds. So that would be your objective as Thorek, would be to go and put together the Granti Duraz, which you could then use in a final culminating battle. I've come up with a better idea that is a little bit more cohesive between the two factions, and we'll go into that at the end of this video, but I feel like it's worth mentioning, at least in this section, as a possible Vortex objective I at least had in mind. Let's jump into the Skaven and go into the skittering, disgusting... I just don't like Skaven. We're going to talk about Skaven next. And it's not really that I don't like Skaven, it's just that they're covered in, like, buboes, and they're falling apart, they're chittering all the time, they're paranoid. It's like living with a drug addict. But let's jump on over to our next list, and obviously, Throt the Unclean. Now, as far as the name for this one, I've just gone simply with Clan Moulder. There's no special or crazy way to do this. I think it could be pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Now, as you can see from these units here, these lords, we didn't include in this list the other options for legendary lords for the Skaven, and that would be Deathmaster Snickich. I think Deathmaster Snickich is one that I think a lot of people would like, but the issues that I see with that is that Clan Eshin's roster, for the most part, is completely filled out. The only units for Clan Eshin that don't exist are ones from the Storm of Chaos supplement, but that's mainly taking a Sorcerer, Master Assassin, Lord, and then 3 other Assassins and making them as a single unit. Think of the Ulthway Seer Council from 40k, only Eshin and Skaven theme instead. So, in that light, I just don't think of any other Eshin units that are really missing. In addition to that, Snickich even has a special rule on tabletop that prevents him from being a leader. I think that the ways that they could incorporate Snickich into Total War, though, would be something along the lines of a Rite, in the same that we get with a Lithanar and his Shadow Master, and the ability to go assassinate things. Or even with Gotrek and Felix, where he's he's summoned for a certain amount of time, 20 turns, and you can use him as an agent of destruction, going and killing things here and there. I think that would make a little bit more sense for Deathmaster Snickich, or again, something where you can get him like donating food, summoning a building, like you can with the Slan, something where he is bound to everyone's campaign and he has to fulfill a certain requirement to be summoned. Now, the other lord on this list, and in my mind, I think it's the lord that we would get as an FLC lord if there was a pack like this, would be Thanquol. And I think that is what Rich is talking about in that AMA when he says a fan favorite. There are a lot of people that have wanted Thanquol and Bone Ripper for a long time. And when you think about the relationship between Thanquol, Bone Ripper, and Clan Moulder, it's quite tight. It would make a lot of sense. In, I believe, Andy Hall's publication in Total War Warhammer, he has Thanquol leading Clan Scurvy. So this would be a chance to bring Clan Scurvy to the table and have Thanquol be the leader of that clan. And furthermore, on top of it, Bone Ripper himself, he has all these different iterations. In the actual lore itself, he's got 13 iterations, and in End Times, he has his 14th iteration, which is this big, hulking, massive beast. And if you kind of think of that, he kind of borrows the skeleton, more or less, of the Necrofex Colossus with Noctilus on it. I mean, if you want to just swap out Noctilus with Thanquol and you want to put a bunch of skin on that Colossus, you basically have Thanquol and Bone Ripper. So to really think that that could be added to the game is pretty plausible, especially with what we've gotten with Gotrek and Felix. This ability to fulfill a criteria and summon a legendary lord and his heroic hero in tow with Gotrek and then Felix, with Thanquol and then Bone Ripper, if they want to do it like that. For me, it's kind of hard to decide if they would do a Thanquol and a Bone Ripper combo as a Lord Hero, or if Thanquol would just be a Grayseer with mount options up to Bone Ripper and then skills to buff up Bone Ripper. That's the only thing I could think of, really, to be totally honest, outside of those two options. Maybe they could make it so that you could get Bone Ripper through a right as well if you had the Thanquol campaign, but I think that having Thanquol have the ability to use Bone Ripper at in any time without a right is a little bit more thematic and true to form. Now, as far as the rest of our units here, we can see for the Lord choice, we have a Master Mutator, a generic version of Throt, a Master Moulder, a hero version of the Master Mutator, and something that I would see very Tomb Kings-ish in the sense of it having the ability to heal monstrous units. And then for those units, we've got a Wolf Rat, a Giant Rat, a Brood Horror, which is very similar to a Giant Rat, and then multiple variants of the Rat Ogres, which we'll go into, an Aberration, and then finally a Chimera Rat. So let's jump into these, go into each and every single one of these and how I would see them incorporated into Total War Warhammer 2. So Throt the Unclean is our first choice here for the Legendary Lord. It makes the most sense. I think he would have two quest items, the Creature Killer and the Whip of Domination. Maybe the Whip of Domination is a way to cull the leadership, I guess, loopholes of some of the larger constructs of larger creatures of Clan Moulder. And I think also, I forgot to mention this, that the faction name for Throt the Unclean would just simply be Clan Moulder. I don't think it needs to be anything like Throt's Unclean Bathwater or anything like that. Clan Moulder, boom, simple open and shut case. So, Creature Killer and Whip of Domination, that can also play into his campaign effects. So the leadership aura around Throt could also make all monstrous units immune to psychology as a Whip of Domination effect from the item itself. As far as actual true campaign effects, upkeep and recruit cost reduction for Moulder units is going to be probably the theme or the way that they would go with this. He does have a Voracious Hunger ability, and the way I would see this translated into Total War Warhammer is something kind of similar to what we get with Morker Shadowgave, right? Where he can activate abilities automatically does it, under a certain threshold of health. Maybe it'll be like that for Voracious Hunger, where he can outright eat a unit of his own army to heal himself. And I think that'd be a real cool way to, okay, I've got a 15 or 20% health left Skaven slave unit, boom, I'm going to eat them. And maybe the higher the cost unit of the either upkeep or cost of the actual campaign cost or multiplayer cost increases the amount healed. I'm not sure how they could do that as far as like that scale, but or maybe it's just a static amount and he always heals it if you can get to a unit in time to eat them. But that's why I think Throt the Unclean could be translated into Total War Warhammer. Now again, I'm going to combine both the Master Mutator and Moulder together. I think the Mutator could be very similar to Throt, with again his own generic skill. Maybe he doesn't have Voracious Hunger, he just has a different ability that is more driven towards the leadership or quelling of poor leadership of the Clan Moulder units. Maybe that's how the Mutator works. Now as far as the Moulder goes, I could see this being something very similar to what we get with the Tomb Kings. The ability to heal monstrous unit and or granting them leadership bonuses, similar to how Cold-Blooded used to work. So maybe you look at something like the Brood Horror, which we're soon to talk about, or the Aberrations, or the Helpit Abomination, or the Chimera Rats, and you can use the ability to heal them from the Master Moulder, making them a little bit more of a shoo-in and useful in a monster-driven Skaven army. And that's what I think is really missing for the Skaven is these big, huge monsters that you get from Clan Moulder. And I think that's, again, waiting for a DLC like this to incorporate all those big, disgusting, just freaks of nature that Clan Moulder makes. And some of those we're going to talk about right now. The first one here is the Wolf Rat. Now, I think this one's going to be very, very easy. I'm not even going to go into it huge. The Monstrous Arcanum talks about them in the sense of them being kind of like voracious, like overwhelming pack units. So, direwolves, chaos warhounds, same type of thing with a wolf rat. It's a wolf body with a rat head, pretty much. It's a disgusting Clan Moulder creation. Now, on that very same coin, the giant rat, I think, operates a little bit different than the wolf rat. I think that the giant rat could be along the lines of the Norscan ice wolves. Now, at the same time, I think that these roles could be reversed. The giant rat could be the fast attack wolf unit, and the wolf rat could be more like a Norscan ice wolf. I think that, or I'm sorry, I said that right. I think that that's probably my big issue with looking at these two units. The giant rat plays a very huge role in Clan Moulder society, almost kind of like a throw-in with every purchase. It's kind of funny. And the wolf rat marks a really cool kind of Clan Mouldery evolution on your typical giant rat. I mean, to be totally honest, they're a little bit redundant, and even just getting rid of one for the other wouldn't be totally the wrong way to go. But I think that presenting both of them to you guys is what I really wanted to do to show how Clan Moulder operates as far as putting a rat head on anything and then giving it a new name. And giant rats also play an important role in the brood horror, which we'll get into in just a little bit. Now, our next option here are the rat ogre variants. Now, we know we've got rat ogres. They're simple, they're awesome, 800 points, do a lot of great damage, AP. Now, what about all the different variations? Now, for those of you guys who don't know, there is a Hell Pit, of course, being the capital location or city of Clan Moulder. So there is a Hell Pit army list in the White Dwarf. And a lot of these units are actually from that army list. The rat ogre variants, the aberrations, the chimera rats, all of them hail from that army list. So when we take a look at stuff like the augmented army or rat ogre, I'm thinking something that is more AP, anti-large, faster with maybe just lower melee defense. And when we transition to something like an armored rat ogre, high armor, high melee defense than normal rat ogres, and AP. Trade-off maybe being that they're slower. So you get more of a tanky guard style unit versus, or maybe even they just go toe-to-toe with some of the heavier cav. And lastly, you have a mutant rat ogre. Now, these guys I think of as just completely berserk insane. So AP, anti-infantry, maybe even poison attacks because they're mutants, but also grant them frenzy. And what if maybe even rampage? Because again, I picture these things as just completely out of control, ripping through stuff in an AP anti-infantry centric way. That kind of squares things off on the smaller side of the roster. Let's get into some of the bigger portions of it now. Our first one being the Brood Horror. Now, really the way the Monstrous Arcanum describes these guys as when there's a litter of giant rats, sometimes one giant rat eats the rest and keeps eating other giant rats and just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and becomes a Brood Horror. This thing is a mount option. It sounds like I said Brood Horror. Brood Horror. This thing is a mount option for Claw Lords in Forge World model. So I could see this thing as a possible mount option for Master Mutators. Throt the Unclean, I think it'd be too large to have a mount, but maybe they could just scale him down and give him and plop him on one of these little bad boys. Now, he does have some other modifications he can have, like he can have like a Clan Scryer / armored variant that gives him magic attacks. He can be Pestilent, that gives him Pestilent Breath. Now, he can also regenerate, and he would have poison attacks. But here's an interesting mechanic, right? So we look at stuff like the Hell Pit Abomination, and it can explode and release Skaven clan rats, actually I think Skaven slaves. But what if for the Brood Horror, because this is indicative of his rules, when he dies, he causes a gaseous explosion in the same way that we get with the Bloating Corpse, or Bloating Corpse from Vampire Coast. So yeah, maybe you've got this thing terrorizing through your lines and you're trying to bring it down as fast as you can, but you know if you do and it's still in your lines, it's going to explode and do a ton of damage to both you and the Skaven player. So I think that is a lot of Skaven-y goodness all in one little Clan Moulder Brood Horror package. Now this next one, the Aberration, I think is going to be very easy. Think of the Hydra and Charybdis, right? They get an anti-large variant and an anti-infantry variant. This is simply a different Hell Pit Abomination in my mind. From what I read in the White Dwarf rules, it just simply seems to be like a different version of a Hell Pit Abomination. So, Hell Pit Abomination is anti-large. Well, have the Aberration do anti-infantry and be unbreakable. I mean, that's unbreakable is one of its special rules. I think this is a very easy one-to-one translation and something that we already get with the Hydra Charybdis that we have from the Dark Elves. Speaking of Hydra, the Chimera Rat is a pretty interesting one. It's got like a rat ogre's body, like a hydra's neck, and then a rat's head. It's disgusting. It's interesting. It's weird. But I can see it having very similar profile to a hydra, having a warp fire breath attack that hurts leadership maybe, AP, terror, single entity, something that just kind of adds to that Clan Moulder large, disgusting creature profile that you get with, well, Clan Moulder. And that really draws to an end all of our unit options here for the Clan Moulder Skaven variant of this DLC. Let's dive into the faction-specific mechanic, which I think is the real bread and butter of Clan Moulder. But when we take a look at Clan Scryer, we have their workshop, right? Well, for Clan Moulder, I want Flesh Workshop, a Flesh Lab, something like that, that really kind of gives a strong nod to the way Clan Moulder does its business. It uses warpstone and all sorts of just insane ways to make their own disgusting beasts of war. So I think that adding a Flesh Lab, again, another awesome idea from Matt Ross here, would be an amazing way to kind of create the same mechanics we get from the Runic Forge of that rule of 3, but in a Skaven-y way. Let's take a look at some of these rules that we've established for the Flesh Labs. 1, every experiment needs a brain, a body, and an augmentation. Then 2, crafting costs food and it can also fail. 3, parts are limited to sizes, types, and specific units. And 4, tiered quality of parts. The higher the part, the better the bonus, obviously. Now, what a lot of this really means and how to really break this out is if you're taking a look at it, we took a look at the way the runes worked, right? And we were saying that, okay, 3 runes per item or per unit. Well, for this, we're saying each experiment requires a brain, a body, and an augmentation. So that brain, that body, then results in something, and then an augmentation. So take, for example, if I wanted to make a stronger rat ogre, well, I'm going to use a zombie brain that's going to make him immune to psychology, maybe reduce his melee attack. I'm going to use a rat ogre body, because that'll then give me a rat ogre, which you would then have by default. I think that's the big thing, is you would have all the Skaven units by default. And then maybe the augmentation would be troll blood to give him regeneration. And if you really want to expand on this, you could say that maybe going and getting Throg gives you the augmentation of both regeneration and unbreakable. You can really go crazy with this. I think that using this or acquiring these individual body parts makes for a very fun way to play a Skaven campaign, right? So if you kind of think of it, you'd have starter parts that you would have from every single Skaven. Maybe putting a rat ogre brain in a Skaven clan rat would result in a stronger clan rat, but maybe there's certain things that they can't do. Maybe move as fast, whatever it is. So having these benefits, you can kind of mix and match what you want. But as you kind of progress through your campaign, you find different flesh, I guess you could call it, as a currency. And you defeat different races to acquire different brains, bodies, and augmentations. This would give a lot of credence, yet again, to the access of rogue armies. And if where I'm going to say that this gentleman, Throt the Unclean, starts on the map, he would have access to chaos very quickly. He would have access to high elves and dark elves quite fast. So doing these things makes for a real fun and interesting campaign, because when I talk about the faction mechanic for both these, it's going to make a lot of sense why you would be ranging across the world and fighting so many different opponents and getting such different portions of flesh. In addition to, I think that research could also grant you certain brains, bodies, augmentations, or maybe even reduce the cost on brains, bodies, augmentations, so on and so forth. But I think this is a way to add something to the game that is very Clan Moulder by using a system that's already established with the Scryer workshops. As far as the starting location goes for Throt the Unclean, there are quite a lot of options on the map. Now, when we take a look at the Vortex map, we can really place this gentleman anywhere. Why do I keep calling him a gentleman? He's a disgusting, huge, monstrous rat creature. Either way, Brock could go wherever he wants because that's a Skaven-y thing, and since he's Clan Moulder and Hell Pit is on the Mortal Empires map, you could make an argument for him being anywhere in the Vortex map. Now, with what I have in mind for their special mechanic, I think that you could put him in the Western Jungle. That makes him very close to Karak Zorn, also very close to Tic-Tac-Toe and the such. But if we're going to talk about the Mortal Empires map, I think it makes a lot of sense to put him far, far, far to the north, above Ulthuan in the Chaos Wastes up there. And my reasoning behind that is, if you were to put Throt the Unclean in the Mortal Empires map, in Hell Pit, in Troll Country, needless to say, I think you really need to make him have the ability to inhabit Chaos Wastes without it being a penalty for him. Make that be a habitable terrain type for him. So that's why I think that in the Mortal Empires, just throw him far to the north where there is tons of Chaos Wastes, and you can maybe make Chaos Wastes, snowy mountainous regions, stuff that you already get through the majority of Nagaroth, as a really good option for him to expand into. And then when you look at the Mortal Empires campaign, putting him in Hell Pit, in Troll Country, where he is historically supposed to be, makes the most sense, and as far as that kind of plays together very well with what I would think for his terrain. Now, if Thanquol were to be a starting lord here, I do not know where they could possibly place him. Like I said, Andy Hall's publication references him leading Clan Scurvy itself having a very large naval presence. So they could use the kind of adapted or modified horde mechanic of Nakai. And we know that Thanquol jumps around all over the old world, new world, null world, because that's what he does. He's always jumping all over the place for his machinations. He's not necessarily leading Clan Thanquol into some grand plan of excellence. He's always jumping to different things. So that could be kind of how it operates. He maybe controls his own army through a horde, and Clan Scurvy is the guardians of the jungle that inhabits what he takes over. That might be how they do it, or agents of the Horned Rat, whatever they want to do. Or Thanquol just gets slapped into a different Clan Scurvy altogether and give him his own kind of standard starting location, maybe in like the Dragon Isles or something like that. There's a lot of places you could go with Thanquol, but I think that kind of squares away our starting location for the Skaven. Let's jump into that faction mechanic I've been kind of teasing all video for both the Dwarfs and the Skaven. And I toiled over this for a long time. What would be a good uniting objective for these two factions that also was thematic, wasn't over the top, wasn't ridiculous? I mean, I was really sold on the notion of doing the Granti Duras for the Dwarfs. But I think that what would make a little bit more sense is the last big campaign that Warhammer Fantasy held, and that was the Nemesis Crown. That was something that brought all of the factions together to vie for control of this crown. So for those of you who don't know what the Nemesis Crown is, it was a crown created by Alaric the Mad, which was a runesmith, well, rune lord, of the Dwarfs. And when he created this, it's gone through all these different owners and hands and so on and so forth, and I think it'd be a really cool way to bring these two factions together. Clan Moulder using to get control of the Nemesis Crown to control any beast that he so wishes, and Thorek Ironbrow looking to get control of the crown because the Dwarfs in that campaign were looking to seek out that crown and put it under lock and key, like lock it away in a vault so that it could kind of basically hide the shame of Alaric the Mad. So rather than having it be a single tangible object, or keep it as a tangible object and leave clues to where it is, that's how I think this campaign would kind of operate. Very similar to what we get with the Vampire Coast and the Sea Shanties and the Tomb Kings and the Books of Nagash. You're either looking for individual parts of the Nemesis Crown, or you're seeking out hints or clues to the location of the Nemesis Crown. And this can maybe be 4 parts or 4 clues that then culminate in a final battle where the opposite lord is defending the location because they've gotten to it first, and they're going to get whatever benefits they get from it. And maybe the culmination to the end of the fight could be that you have the Nemesis Crown in a similar effect to the Sword of Cain. Like, okay, it grants all these bonuses with some of these negative penalties. It's like, okay, you've completed the campaign. now use the crown to finish your grand conquest. I think that'd be kind of a really cool button on the campaign. But at the same time, your opponent at that final stage of that campaign has access to the crown. And I think that'd be really cool. And you could still include the Gronti Duras into this, this giant rune golem. And I think that is such an awesome image of this almost like a Warhammer 40,000 Titan for the dwarfs added into Warhammer Fantasy, kind of marching down range. And you could use that in the final battle if you are Thorek fighting against Throt, and you're like that, you're playing as Thorek. And maybe there could be something equivalent for Throt, like if you do some sort of side quest that, hey, this is only going to make the final battle easier, much like what we get with the Hunts Marshal. How the Hunts Marshal can unlock his individual heroes, and it makes his final battle easier, but you don't have to do it. I think that'd be kind of a cool way to include the Gronti Duras, or even maybe Thankful into Throt's campaign. Some way to get an additional asset to be used in that final fight as just a way to make it even more epic. But that, I think, is a really good unifying mechanic and objective for the Vortex campaign for both Clan Moulder and Thorek's Throng, not to be confused with Thorek's Thong, which would be disgusting. So let me know what you guys think about a really cool Vortex objective that would make a lot of sense for these two lords, Thorek and Throt the Unclean, to pursue. I did toil over this one, like I said, for a long time, and I think that ultimately landing on the Nemesis Crown is a very good and very succinct and also easy thing to play into. You could even expand this out to another objective for another race that doesn't really seem to make a lot of sense in the Vortex Grand campaign. Like, oh, wait, well, we're going to add this race as Legendary Lord, and let's just tack them onto the Nemesis Crown. Because, like I said, in that campaign, you had every single race vying for control of that crown. With that being said, that draws our video to a close here, guys. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. In fact, the original genesis of this video was me talking about Eltharion and Grom the Paunch. And I still plan on doing that video with a very similar format to what you've seen here today. So if this formula, you really enjoy this, let me know what you didn't enjoy or what you really enjoyed, so I know how to kind of better procure, that's a weird word, that Grom and Eltharion video. Because I did want to do that video first, but like I said, since they decided to choose this next DLC to be focused more on quality of life changes and not an old world update, and I feel that if you did a Grom and Eltharion DLC without doing a Greenskins update, you'd have everyone fucking riot. So that's why I kind of decided to do this one first. We don't really know what's coming, and it could be any number of things, and since we're not getting an old world faction updated, my guess is, like I was saying earlier, we're not going to be seeing a Warhammer 1 old world race added to this that hasn't been already updated. Now, this is to say that maybe we're not going to see any Warhammer 1 races in this DLC. I kind of like the theme of doing a Warhammer 1 and 2 race, hence why I've chosen Dwarfs and Skaven, but this could simply be another, let's just say, Skaven and High Elves. This could be Dark Elves and Tomb Kings. It could be Vampire Coast and Lizardmen. I don't know what it could be. But this was a fun little foray down a thought path that I think that we've all kind of wanted to take since we heard about the Festag DLC. Let me know in the comment section below what worked for you, what didn't work for you. Maybe the video itself just sucked. That's okay, that happens. But in the long run, I really want to get a good idea on how the formula of these videos can really work, so I can do a lot more of them. I know we have a long time until Total War Warhammer 3 probably comes out, but we're hopefully going to be seeing more DLC in that time, so why not have a lot of fun with you guys speculating on some of the more crazy things we could see. Like, I never in a million years thought I would talk about the Rune Guardians or the Rune Golems or even the Shard Dragons as it pertains to a dwarf army list, but I think that with what the dwarfs lack as far as staying power against these larger, bigger beasts of Total War Warhammer, it makes a lot of sense to give them an ability to create roadblocks against these large creatures. And then when you take a look at Skaven, you think of a very monster-centric faction, much in the same way that you do Beastmen and Greenskins, but for different reasons. Because the Skaven are known for their disgusting constructs of flesh and terrible warp sorcery. So with Clan Moulder, you get a lot of really cool stuff brought to the table. hopefully you guys enjoyed this video here today, and there was a lot of really cool stuff that kind of at least piqued your interest or got your own speculation trains chewing. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one, and take care.